In a quiet small-town street, a tense encounter begins when a white police officer confronts an elderly black man for no clear reason. The moment escalates into shocking disrespect, setting the tone for a story where dignity clashes with arrogance. The old man's calm presence hides something deeper, while the officer's arrogance leads to a symbolic act that will change everything. "We don't need your kind loitering here." The words cut through the still afternoon air like a blade. Officer Brad Coleman's voice was cold, sharp, and dripping with disdain. On the corner of Main Street, sunlight bounced off the polished metal of his badge, but there was nothing honorable in his tone. A few passers-by stopped, uneasy. Some turned their heads and pretended not to notice. In this town, silence had long been the cheapest currency. The target of his venom was an old black man, thin, gray-haired, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt tucked into faded slacks. His walking cane leaned against the bench beside him, and his hands rested calmly over it. He wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't begging. He wasn't loud. He was simply sitting. But to Brad, authority meant dominance, and dominance demanded spectacle. "Did you hear me, old man?" Brad barked, stepping forward. "Move along before I make you." The old man lifted his gaze slowly, his deep brown eyes unshaken. There was a quiet weight in his stare, as if he had seen men like Brad his entire life. His silence wasn't fear, it was patience. The bystanders shifted. A young mother tugged her child away. Two teenagers froze, whispering. An older shopkeeper across the street folded his arms, conflicted. Everyone knew Brad. Everyone knew his temper. Brad sneered. "Don't just sit there staring at me like you're somebody. Get up." The man's lips moved, soft but clear. "Son, respect goes further than anger." The words, delivered with unflinching calm, struck harder than a shout. Brad's face reddened. He couldn't stand being defied, especially not in front of others. Without hesitation, he shoved the man's shoulder. The cane toppled to the ground, clattering against the pavement. Gasps filled the air. The old man stumbled back, but somehow he did not fall. His hand gripped the edge of the bench, steadying himself with quiet dignity. Brad grinned cruelly, satisfied. "That's what I thought." But the silence that followed wasn't victory. It was heavy, thick, uncomfortable. The onlookers weren't applauding his authority, they were frozen, horrified. The old man bent slowly, picked up his cane, and straightened. For a moment, the sunlight caught the gold ring on his finger, gleaming with quiet significance. He looked directly into Brad's eyes, his voice low but firm. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." The words sliced through the officer's arrogance, leaving a flicker of doubt in his chest. The crowd murmured. Something had shifted. The old man tapped his cane once on the ground, a sharp echo that carried across the street, then turned as though to walk away. But before he took a step, he looked back, his expression unreadable, almost sorrowful. The cliffhanger lingered. Who was he? Why did his words feel heavier than his frail frame? For the first time in years, Officer Brad Coleman felt a shiver of uncertainty crawl down his spine. "Did you see that?" A woman whispered, clutching her purse tighter. The murmurs spread like ripples across the sidewalk. People had witnessed police overreach before, but something about this moment felt different, heavier, sharper, impossible to brush away. Officer Brad Coleman stood tall, puffing his chest out like a conqueror, though inside his pride was already twisting into something else. The old man hadn't screamed. He hadn't cursed. He hadn't even begged. His silence was louder than 1,000 shouts. "Move along." Brad snapped, pointing at the small group of onlookers who lingered. "Show's over." But the people didn't scatter. They didn't obey. They watched. They whispered. And that frightened Brad more than he'd admit. Across the street, Mr. Lewis, The elderly shopkeeper who'd run his corner store for 40 years narrowed his eyes. He recognized the man on the bench. Not by name, no, that wasn't it. By presence. By the way he carried himself, dignified, steady, like someone who had once worn a uniform. That ain't just some old man, Lewis muttered under his breath. The teens who'd seen everything exchanged wide-eyed glances. Bro, he didn't even flinch when the cop shoved him, one whispered. That's crazy. The old man, meanwhile, adjusted his cane and sat back down, his expression calm but his posture deliberate. He was not leaving. Not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. Every movement said, I belong here as much as anyone else. Brad's jaw clenched. He was used to fear, to compliance. But this was defiance wrapped in silence, and it unnerved him. Sir, Brad spat the word like poison. I said move. Don't make this harder. The old man's gaze lifted slowly, steady as stone. Son, you don't know the ground you're standing on. The cryptic words drew murmurs again. The crowd leaned in without realizing it. Every syllable felt weighted, as if carried from a place deeper than the present moment. Brad scoffed, trying to shake the unease prickling at the back of his neck. Big words for somebody sitting on a park bench with a stick. The old man's lips curved, not into a smile but into something quieter pity. Sticks break. Truth doesn't. The silence afterward was unbearable. Even the birds seemed to pause in the trees above. Brad, desperate to reclaim authority, grabbed the old man's arm as though to drag him up. Gasps erupted from the crowd. One voice shouted, Hey, leave him alone. Another hissed, That's too much, officer. For the first time, resistance stirred. The old man didn't fight. He let Brad's grip tighten, but his eyes never broke away. They were old eyes, weathered eyes, eyes that had seen marshes, battles, betrayals, and victories. You'll regret this, the man said softly, not in anger, but in certainty. Brad's stomach twisted. He hated that certainty, hated that tone. It wasn't rebellion, it was prophecy. Suddenly, a young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. Mama, he whispered loudly enough for others to hear. Isn't that the man from the newspaper? The one who, the mother hushed him quickly, glancing nervously at the officer. But the seed had been planted. People exchanged knowing looks. Curiosity ignited. Who was this old man? Brad yanked his arm back, frustrated, but the whispers were louder now, circling him like ghosts. He could feel the crowd slipping out of his control, their loyalty cracking. And in the middle of it all, the old man sat still, cane in hand, gaze steady. A storm of dignity waiting to break open. Brad didn't know it yet, but his push had set in motion a truth he could never contain. Brad Coleman's hand drifted toward his chest, brushing against the polished badge pinned there. He tapped it twice hard, letting the sun catch the shine. You see this? He barked, voice rising above the murmurs. This badge means I'm the law here. When I say move, you move. End of story. The crowd stirred uneasily. His words were loud, but they carried more insecurity than authority. The old man leaned back slightly, resting both hands on the cane in front of him. His breathing was steady, his presence unshaken. That badge, he said slowly, isn't the law. It's just metal. A man makes it worth something or nothing at all. The air tightened. Even the teenagers stopped whispering. The old man's tone wasn't rebellious. It was factual, rooted in a wisdom that pierced deeper than Brad wanted to admit. Brad's jaw flexed. Careful, old man. Words like that can get you locked up. The old man tilted his head. For telling the truth? A ripple of reaction passed through the crowd. Someone muttered, He's right. Another added, That cop's going too far. Brad felt the balance shifting, slipping through his fingers. He raised his voice louder, as if volume could reclaim it. You people think he's some kind of hero? He's just another troublemaker. I've dealt with plenty like him. The old man finally pushed himself to his feet. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if rising carried the weight of decades. Standing, he was taller than he'd appeared on the bench, his posture straight despite the cane. Plenty like me? His voice carried across the street, low but powerful. Son, you don't know how few of us are left. The crowd hushed. Brad took a step back before catching himself. No, he couldn't show weakness. Not here. Not in front of them. You don't scare me, he snapped, forcing bravado. The old man's eyes softened, almost sorrowful. I'm not here to scare you. But you've already scared yourself. The line landed heavy. Brad's face flushed, and in a flash of anger, he yanked the badge off his chest and held it up. This is authority. This means I'm in charge. Don't you forget it. The old man studied the badge, then lifted his cane, tapping it gently against the metal. Clink. The small sound echoed louder than Brad expected. A badge without honor, the old man murmured, is nothing but a burden. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The crowd absorbed the words, their weight settling in the pit of their stomachs. It wasn't just a rebuke, it was a truth they all recognized but rarely spoke aloud. Brad shoved the badge back onto his chest, his hand trembling despite himself. He turned sharply to the onlookers. Anyone else want to disrespect the law today? Anyone? But no one responded. Their eyes weren't on him anymore. They were fixed on the old man. Mr. Lewis, the shopkeeper, whispered to the woman beside him. I know that look. I saw his picture once. In the paper. Years back. The woman leaned closer. Who is he? Lewis's voice was low, reverent. A man who's carried more than that cop ever will. The whispers grew louder, spreading like wildfire. The story was slipping out of Brad's control, twisting, reshaping. He was no longer the authority, he was the aggressor, and in the center of it all, the old man stood calmly, cane in hand, eyes steady, carrying not just his own dignity but the weight of history itself. The silence on Main Street had stretched so thin it could break with a whisper. And that's exactly how it broke. I know who he is, Mr. Lewis. The shopkeeper said aloud this time, his voice shaking with something between awe and fear. Heads turned toward him. Brad's eyes narrowed. What did you say? Lewis swallowed, but the words refused to hide. That man isn't just anybody. His name is Henry Carter. The name rolled through the crowd like a thunderclap. The teens gasped. The mother holding her son looked stunned. Even those who didn't immediately recognize it felt the weight in the way it was spoken. Brad scoffed, trying to reclaim control. Henry Carter? Never heard of him, but Lewis shook his head. Then you haven't been paying attention. Years ago, he was in the paper. More than once. Enough. Brad snapped, stepping toward Lewis. Stay out of this. I don't care who he is. He's loitering, and I gave an order. That's all that matters. But it wasn't all that mattered, not anymore. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity lit like a flame. The old man Henry Carter didn't flinch. He didn't confirm or deny. He just stood, cane steady, eyes calm, letting others speak for him. One of the teenagers pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen. Within seconds, he whispered, Yo, he's right. I just found an old article. Says Henry Carter was a war veteran. A decorated one. Gasps rippled again. The mother pressed a hand to her mouth. Oh, my Lord. Brad's face reddened. Don't listen to this nonsense. He's just some old guy trying to get sympathy. Probably feeding you lies. But the crowd's energy had shifted. Suspicion wasn't on Henry anymore. It was on Brad. Henry finally spoke, his voice deep, steady. I don't need to prove anything to you. My life's been written in places you can't erase. Brad jabbed a finger at him, trying to shatter the moment. You think a dusty old story makes you untouchable? Not in my town. Not while I wear this badge. Henry's eyes softened, but his words were sharp. Your town? Or everyone's town? The line cut deep. Some in the crowd nodded, their courage slowly surfacing. One voice from the back muttered, "This ain't right." Another added louder, "Leave him be." Brad spun around, shouting, "Quiet!" But the more he demanded silence, the louder the dissent became. Henry lowered himself back onto the bench, resting both hands on the cane. His movement wasn't surrender, it was a statement. He would not be moved by force, nor by arrogance. You pushed me once, Henry said evenly. But pushing truth doesn't make it fall. The words struck Brad like a slap. He felt his chest tighten, though he masked it with anger. This ends now, Brad growled. But even as he said it, he knew something had already begun, something he couldn't stop, because the name had been spoken. And once spoken, names echo. The crowd knew it now. Henry Carter wasn't just an old man on a bench. He was somebody. Somebody whose past carried weight. Somebody whose dignity turned Brad's authority hollow. The truth had begun its slow, unstoppable march. Henry Carter remained seated on the bench, cane balanced between his knees, his shoulders steady. The name was out now, drifting through the crowd like smoke, refusing to vanish. A teenager. Phone still glowing in his hand, read aloud. It says here, Henry Carter, Vietnam veteran. Awarded the Bronze Star and Purple Heart. The words struck the crowd with the force of revelation. Murmurs broke into gasps. A few elderly men exchanged solemn nods. They knew what those medals meant. Brad's face twisted. You believe everything you read online? Don't be stupid. He's just some old man feeding you fairy tales, but his voice cracked on the last word. Even he felt the ground shifting beneath him. Henry looked up, his gaze sweeping across the bystanders. I don't need to tell my story. It's stitched into scars, not papers. Slowly, he unbuttoned the top of his shirt. Beneath it, worn but carefully preserved, a chain held a dull military dog tag. It swung slightly in the sunlight, and the reaction was immediate. The crowd gasped again, this time not with curiosity, but with reverence. An older man stepped forward from the back. His hair was white, his frame bent, but his voice was steady. I served too, he said, lifting his own cap. I know what it takes to wear one of those. The two men locked eyes, strangers bound by the same language of sacrifice. Respect radiated silently from that connection. Brad, panicked, stepped forward, barking, Dog tags? Big deal. Anybody can get those at a pawn shop. The crowd didn't buy it. Their eyes weren't on him anymore. They were locked on Henry, on the weight of what he carried. Henry's hand closed around the tag, his thumb brushing over the engraved letters worn by time. I bled for this country, he said, voice low but carrying. I buried brothers who never came home. And still, after all that, you push me down like I'm less than a man? A hush fell. The raw truth in his words pressed heavy on every chest. Some lowered their heads. Others clenched their fists. Brad tried to laugh it off, but it rang hollow. What do you want, a parade? You think medals make you above the law? Henry's eyes locked with his, calm but piercing. No, medals don't put me above the law. They prove I fought for a law worth respecting. The crowd erupted not in cheers, but in murmurs of agreement. Soft voices growing louder. That's right. He's right. Respect him. Brad's authority slipped further. He could feel it draining away, stolen not by violence but by truth. Henry tapped his cane once against the ground, the sharp sound pulling everyone's attention back to him. This isn't about me. It's about what kind of men we let hold power. A badge without respect, a hand without restraint, Those destroy more than they protect." The words hung heavy. The young boy from earlier squeezed his mother's hand. She whispered, "Listen to him, baby. Listen." Brad's fists clenched. "Shut up, old man." But even as he said it, his voice shook. The crowd no longer saw him as the enforcer. They saw him as a bully standing against a wall of dignity he couldn't dent. Henry leaned back, his face calm, his presence towering despite his frail frame. "You wanted to show strength by pushing me. But strength isn't in pushing the weak. It's in standing with what's right." Brad froze, his mouth opening but no words coming. The crowd's eyes bore into him, their silence louder than any verdict. For the first time, Brad realized the truth was no longer a whisper. It was a tide, and it was rising against him. The silence after Henry's words hung like a heavy curtain. For a moment, it felt as if time itself refused to move. Brad's breathing grew louder, ragged in the stillness. He opened his mouth to bark another order, but a voice from the crowd cut across him. "I know this man." Everyone turned. A middle-aged woman pushed her way to the front, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a long shift. She lifted her chin, her eyes blazing. "I treated Mr. Carter last year at the VA hospital," she said firmly. "He still carries shrapnel in his leg from a battlefield half of us couldn't even imagine. And you," she jabbed a finger toward Brad, "you dare push him like he's nothing?" A ripple of murmurs swept through the bystanders. Brad stiffened. "Lady, step back. You're interfering with—" "No," she snapped. "You're interfering with dignity," another voice chimed in. A young man, maybe in his early 30s, raised his phone high. "I've been live streaming since he pushed him. Thousands are watching right now. They see what you're doing. They hear what you're saying." Brad's head whipped toward him, his face pale. "Turn that off." The man didn't budge. "It's too late. You can't silence this." Henry remained still, watching the scene unfold. His presence was like a stone in a river. Everything flowed around him, but he never moved. Then came another revelation. An elderly white veteran stepped forward, his hat embroidered with faded unit patches. "I fought in Korea," he said. His voice cracked, but his pride was steady. He pointed at Henry. "That man's name is carved on a memorial wall in my town. He saved lives that day. He's a hero." Gasps filled the air. The crowd began to press closer, their energy shifting from shock to defense. They weren't just observers anymore, they were witnesses, defenders of truth. Brad raised his hands, desperate to reassert control. "Enough! This isn't about medals or memories. This is about law and order." But a teenager shouted back, "Law and order doesn't look like shoving grandpas to the ground." Laughter and nods rippled through the group. Henry finally spoke, his voice calm yet cutting through the chaos. "Son, you don't have law and order when those who carry the badge disrespect the very people they swore to protect." The words struck deeper than any accusation. Even those who had stayed silent shifted uneasily, unwilling to side with the officer now. Brad lunged forward, pointing at Henry. "You think a few stories will change what's happening here? You're still under my authority." But authority is fragile when no one recognizes it. The crowd no longer looked at him as a protector. They saw him as a man cornered, fighting shadows of his own making. The nurse folded her arms. "Authority without respect is just abuse." The young man with the phone nodded. "And the world is watching your abuse live." Brad's face burned crimson, his jaw tight. His voice rose, almost a scream. "Back off! All of you!" But they didn't. The line between the officer and the people dissolved. Every new voice layered truth upon truth, drowning his commands. Henry gripped his cane, pushed himself slowly to his feet. His knees trembled, but his back was straight. "You see, officer," he said softly, "I don't need to fight you. The truth fights for me, and in that moment, it wasn't Henry standing alone against a cop. It was a crowd, a community, a chorus of witnesses all carrying the truth forward. Brad's hand twitched near his belt, the last tool of a man losing power. But with dozens of eyes and cameras locked on him, even that move felt impossible. The tide had shifted. The witnesses had spoken, and Brad was running out of places to stand. The heat of the afternoon pressed down on the street, but the real weight came from the silence between words. Brad's badge gleamed on his chest, but it no longer shone with authority. It glared like a brand of shame. The nurse pointed at it. "That badge doesn't make you honorable. Your actions define it," the crowd murmured in agreement. Eyes shifted from Henry to Brad, from the veteran's quiet dignity to the officer's trembling rage. Brad gritted his teeth, raising his voice to drown them out. "You don't know what it takes to wear this. You don't understand the responsibility I carry." Henry's cane tapped once against the pavement. "Responsibility is not a weapon. It's a duty." The words cut through him sharper than a blade. Brad's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. "Don't talk to me about duty. I risk my life every day." Henry tilted his head, eyes steady, voice steady. "So did I, for a country that sometimes didn't even want me back. And yet, even wounded, I never shoved my people into the dirt." The crowd hummed with approval, their voices overlapping. "He's right. That's the truth. Listen to him." Brad's jaw twitched. He grabbed at his badge with one hand, holding it out toward the crowd. "This means I have the law on my side. It means you all follow me." A teenager yelled from the back, "No. That means you're supposed to protect us." A wave of nods followed. The tension shifted, the badge itself becoming the trial. The veteran stepped closer, pointing at the emblem pinned to Brad's chest. "That badge is heavy, son. It's not a shield for arrogance. It's a promise. Break it, and you dishonor every man who ever stood for something greater than himself." Brad swallowed, his throat dry. His badge, his anchor, was turning into his chain. Henry's voice dropped low, meant for everyone but aimed straight at Brad. "You wanted power, not service. But power without service rots. And today the rot is showing." The words struck with the force of a gavel. The crowd erupted, this time louder, not just murmurs but chants. Respect. Justice. Do better. Phones lifted higher. Red recording lights blinked like watchful eyes. Brad's world closed in around him. He yanked the badge from his chest, waving it in desperation. "You think you can take this from me? You think you can strip this?" Henry's eyes didn't flinch. "You stripped it yourself when you pushed me down." The hush that followed was deafening. Every word seemed etched in stone. Brad's hand shook, the badge gleaming in his palm like a guilty confession. He tried to speak, but the words clung to his throat. His authority wasn't lost in a fight, it was bleeding out slowly, drained by truth, dignity, and the unblinking eyes of witnesses. Henry stepped forward, leaning lightly on his cane, his presence filling the space between them. "The badge is not on my trial. It's on yours. And you're failing." The nurse folded her arms, the veteran stood firm, and the young man with the live stream raised his camera closer. The crowd's judgment was clear, and Brad, for the first time, felt the unbearable weight of his own badge. The chanting swelled, echoing off the brick buildings. Brad stood at the center of it, badge clenched in his fist, sweat streaking his forehead. His radio crackled, faint voices calling in response to the commotion he had triggered. Then came the sound. Sirens in the distance, wailing closer with each breath. The crowd parted slightly, not in fear but in anticipation. 2 patrol cars screeched to a stop at the curb. Doors slammed. Officers stepped out, 3 men and 1 woman, hands resting near their belts, eyes scanning the restless crowd. Brad's face lit with relief. "Finally," he muttered. He straightened his shoulders, waving his badge as though it could erase everything. "Over here. I need assistance controlling these people." But the new arrivals didn't rush to him. They looked at Henry first, an old black man standing tall with a cane, surrounded by bystanders who shielded him instinctively. The tension in the air told them something was wrong. The nurse pointed straight at Brad. "That's the officer who shoved him." The live streamer turned his phone toward the newcomers. "It's all recorded. Thousands are watching live." One of the officers, a tall black sergeant with graying hair, narrowed his eyes. "Bradley?" His voice carried weight, not anger yet, but authority sharpened by years of command. Brad exhaled sharply, puffing up his chest. "Sarge, I had to act." This old man was causing trouble. The crowd turned on me. "Look at them." The sergeant's gaze shifted to Henry. For a long moment, nothing was said. Then, quietly, "Sir, may I ask your name?" Henry's voice was steady. "Henry Carter." The name struck again, like lightning cracking twice. The sergeant's eyes widened slightly. His stance shifted from suspicion to recognition. "You're Henry Carter?" Henry gave a slow nod. "Last I checked." The sergeant removed his cap, lowering his head in respect. The gesture rippled through the crowd like wind across tall grass. Brad blinked. What's going on here?" "You know him?" The sergeant's eyes cut back toward him, sharp as steel. "Know him? This man's name is carved into history. He's a decorated veteran. A man who bled for the flag you claim to serve under." Brad stumbled. That's just stories. These people are making it bigger than it is." But another officer spoke up, a younger woman with her body cam already active. "Sir, we saw the live stream on the way here. It's not just a story. It's evidence." The crowd murmured in satisfaction. Phones lifted higher, recording every word. Brad's desperation cracked through. "You're all taking their side? Over mine? I'm the one wearing the badge here." The sergeant stepped closer, his shadow falling across Brad. "A badge doesn't excuse a shove. And it doesn't silence the truth." Brad tried to retreat, but the wall of eyes behind him offered no escape. The chants began again, louder now, fueled by the arrival of real authority. Respect. Justice. Henry lifted a hand, calming them. His voice rose above the noise, still calm, still steady. "This isn't about destroying a man. It's about saving what's left of honor in the badge he wears." Even the officers paused, struck by the dignity in his words. The sergeant's jaw tightened. "Mr. Carter, I promise you this will be handled." Brad's voice cracked. "Sarge, please, don't." But it was too late. The tide had turned. His department wasn't here to save him. They were here to see the truth for themselves. The crowd knew it. Brad knew it. And deep down, he realized his trial had only just begun. The street had become a stage, and every eye was locked on Brad. His chest heaved, his uniform clinging with sweat, but no authority remained in his stance. He looked less like an officer of the law and more like a man cornered by his own actions. The sergeant's voice rang out, firm but level. "Bradley, hand over your badge and weapon." The words froze him. "What? No, you can't do this. I'm the one in control here." But he wasn't. Not anymore. The live streamer's phone tilted in closer, catching every bead of sweat, every twitch of his lip. Comments scrolled endlessly across the screen. "Fire him. Shame. This is justice." Brad shook his head violently, pointing at Henry. "You're all making a mistake. He provoked me. He's just some old man who wouldn't follow directions." Henry's calm gaze cut through the storm. "Directions don't excuse disrespect. Orders don't excuse abuse," the crowd murmured, their voices carrying the weight of agreement. The sergeant stepped forward. Bradley, you shoved a decorated veteran. On camera, in front of witnesses. And instead of owning your mistake, you doubled down. His words were measured, but every syllable was heavy as stone. That's not law enforcement. That's disgrace. Brad's knees weakened. His fingers fumbled with the badge still in his grip. The same emblem that once gave him power now burned like a brand in his palm. "Don't do this," he whispered. "Please, I've worked for this my whole life." The younger officer spoke, her voice sharp but not cruel. "And in one moment, you showed the world who you really are. That's not the uniform's fault. That's yours." Phones tilted closer. The chant began again, steady and relentless. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" Brad clutched his head, the noise crashing into him like waves. His authority had been stripped away, not by force but by truth shouted from every corner. The sergeant extended his hand. "Badge, now!" Brad's hand shook violently. He looked at the crowd faces filled with judgment, some with pity, but none with respect. He looked at Henry, standing tall, calm, untouchable. The man he had shoved looked more like an officer than he ever did. Finally, with a broken gasp, Brad slapped the badge into the sergeant's hand. The sound echoed louder than a gunshot. The crowd erupted not in violence, but in release. Applause, shouts of triumph, phones lifted like torches. Henry lowered his cane, his expression solemn. "The badge isn't your enemy, son. Your arrogance is." Brad's lips trembled, his voice hollow. I didn't mean." But the words faltered. Even if he spoke them, no one believed. The sergeant turned, raising the badge high. "This man no longer represents us." Today the people saw the truth. The crowd roared in agreement. Brad sank to his knees, the weight of his actions pressing him down harder than gravity ever could. And Henry, though battered, stood taller than ever, his dignity unshaken. The crowd slowly quieted, their chants fading into a heavy silence. The sergeant pocketed Brad's badge, the weight of it now belonging to accountability rather than power. Brad knelt on the ground, broken and stripped of authority. But no one jeered. No one pushed him down. The punishment was in the silence, in the loss of respect that no badge could ever return. Henry's cane tapped softly as he stepped forward. His knees ached, but his back was straighter than ever. He looked not at Brad, but at the people. "You've all seen what happens when arrogance wears a uniform," he said, his voice carrying across the still air. "But don't mistake this moment. One man's fall does not mean every badge is corrupt. It means every badge carries a choice." The sergeant bowed his head slightly. The younger officers standing in solemn respect. Henry turned slowly, his eyes moving across the bystanders. Mothers holding their children tighter. Teenagers gripping their phones, recording every word. Veterans standing shoulder to shoulder, caps in hand. "The choice is simple," Henry continued. "To serve or to control. To protect or to push down. Respect is not demanded, it's earned. And when we forget that, we lose the very soul of justice." The nurse wiped a tear from her cheek. The live streamer lowered his phone slightly, as if realizing some moments deserved to be felt, not just recorded. Henry raised his dog tag into the sunlight. Its dull shine caught every eye. "I fought for a country that often didn't fight for me. But I stood anyway. Because dignity isn't given, it's chosen, every single day." The crowd erupted, not in chaos but in applause. It wasn't wild, but steady, powerful, like waves against a shore. Brad covered his face, unable to meet their eyes. His collapse was complete, not through violence, but through truth too heavy to escape. The sergeant stepped beside Henry. "Mr. Carter, you have my respect. On behalf of this department, I apologize for what happened today." Henry nodded slowly. "Respect isn't in words, Sergeant. It's in the way you carry that badge tomorrow." The sergeant held his gaze, then gave a solemn nod of understanding that a little boy from the crowd tugged at Henry's sleeve. His eyes were wide, full of innocence. "Mister, when I grow up, I want to be strong like you." Henry smiled softly, kneeling down to meet the boy's eyes. "Strength isn't in pushing people down, son. It's in lifting them up." The boy grinned, his mother's eyes shining with gratitude. As Henry straightened again, the crowd parted, giving him space. He walked slowly down the street, cane clicking against the pavement. Each step was steady. Each breath carried the weight of victory, not over a man, but over a mindset. The live stream ended, but the story had already taken root. Phones would spread it, voices would echo it, and people would remember it. Brad remained on his knees, watching as the old man he had shoved walked away taller than ever. In that moment, Brad knew the truth had stripped him of everything. But Henry Carter, the old black grandpa with scars and medals, had given the world something stronger than punishment. He had given them a lesson in dignity, and dignity, once seen, could never be unseen.